The morning my family tried to erase me from their lives began with a piece of paper on the kitchen table. The house felt wrong before I even reached the stairs. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your chest tighten before you understand why. I remember pausing halfway down the hallway. Listening. No television. No dishes clinking. No sound of my mother moving around the kitchen like she did every morning. When I stepped into the room, all three of them were already there. My father sat at the head of the table with his arms folded. My mother sat beside him, staring down at her coffee as if the mug held something more interesting than the conversation about to happen. My sister Olivia leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, watching me the way someone watches a stranger who wandered into the wrong house. No one said good morning. My father slid a folded piece of paper across the table toward me. I thought it was another lecture. Maybe something about the paperwork for the family business, or another reminder about the management program Olivia had been pushing me to join. I opened it slowly. The words inside were written in my father's handwriting. The same neat block letters he used when labeling company folders. The Marines will ruin your future. If you still plan to join them, leave this house. For a moment, the room felt like it had no air. Olivia let out a quiet laugh from the counter. "Dad's being generous," she said. "If you walk away now, you can still come back to the business." My mother didn't look at me. She kept stirring her coffee even though the spoon had stopped making sound. My father finally spoke. "We won't support this decision. Ava." His voice was calm. Too calm. Like this conversation had already been finished long before I walked into the room. I turned the note over. A pen sat beside my father's coffee cup. I picked it up without asking permission. No one stopped me. 2 words were all I wrote. "Watch me." I folded the paper again and slipped it into my jacket pocket. That was the moment my life split in half. Before the kitchen table, and everything that came after, I grew up believing the Reynolds name meant something in Savannah. My grandfather had built Reynolds Logistics from one warehouse and a pair of delivery trucks. By the time I was old enough to understand what the company did, our family owned half the shipping routes moving goods through the city's industrial district. The business was everything to my father. Every dinner conversation somehow circled back to contracts, expansion plans, or the next warehouse project. Olivia loved it. She had spent years learning the operations side of the company and was already managing several departments by the time she turned 26. Everyone assumed I would eventually join her. That was the plan. It had always been the plan. Until the night before. I still remembered the look on my father's face when I told them I wanted to join the Marines. "You're throwing your life away," he said immediately. Olivia didn't even try to hide her smile. "You couldn't handle the business," she added. "So now you're running off to play soldier." My mother tried to calm the room, but she never actually defended me. My father leaned forward across the table. "The Marines destroy people," he said. "They break them. They ruin families." I asked him why he believed that so strongly. He didn't answer. He just repeated the same sentence. "You belong here. With your family." But I had already made my decision. I wanted something that belonged to me. Not a desk in a warehouse office. Not a position handed to me because of my last name. Purpose. The argument ended with raised voices and slammed doors. By morning, they had already made their choice. And now I had made mine. I went upstairs and packed the smallest duffel bag I owned. Clothes. A pair of boots. My documents. When I came back down, they were still sitting in the kitchen, watching. My father didn't say a word. My mother finally looked up, but only for a second. Olivia shook her head. "You'll be back," she said. "Give it a few months." I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked past them. No one followed me. No one tried to stop me. The front door closed behind me with a sound that echoed across the quiet street. The sun was just beginning to rise over Savannah. I climbed into my old car and started the engine. For a moment, I sat there looking at the house in the rearview mirror. The same porch where I used to sit during summer evenings. The same windows glowing softly in the early light. It had been my home for 29 years. Now it looked like someone else's life. I touched the folded note in my jacket pocket. The paper was still warm from my hand. At the time, I thought leaving that house was the hardest moment of my life. I didn't know that years later a military convoy would stop outside the warehouse behind that same house. And the people who forced me to leave would finally read the 2 words I had written on the back of their note. The bus doors opened and the heat hit us like a wall. I stepped down onto the pavement at Paris Island with a duffel bag on my shoulder and the sound of shouting already echoing across the training yard. Before my boots even touched the ground, a drill instructor was already barking orders at the recruits ahead of me. Move. 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 People scrambled in every direction, dragging bags, bumping into each other, trying to figure out where they were supposed to go. The chaos was so loud it almost drowned out my thoughts. Almost. Because even in that moment, one sentence kept echoing in my head. The Marines will ruin your future. I tightened my grip on the duffel strap and stepped forward. If my family thought this place would break me, they clearly had no idea what I was made of. The first week of boot camp felt like being dropped into another world. Sleep disappeared. Privacy disappeared. Comfort disappeared. Everything became a schedule. Wake up before sunrise. Run until your lungs burned. Drill after drill after drill. The instructors watched everything. The way you walked. The way you spoke. Even the way you stood still. Any mistake meant punishment for the entire group. I learned quickly that the Marines were not interested in excuses. Only results. During one of the early morning formation drills, I noticed a woman standing 2 places to my left who seemed unusually calm compared to everyone else. Her name tag read Diaz. Later that night, when we finally had a few minutes to sit down in the barracks, she glanced over at me. "You're either very brave or very stubborn," she said. I looked up from cleaning my boots. "Why?" "You didn't panic on the arrival deck," she said. "Most people look like they're about to run." I shrugged. Running wasn't really an option. She studied me for a moment. "Why'd you join?" For a second, I thought about the kitchen table, the note, my sister's voice telling me I would come crawling back. But I didn't say any of that. I had something to prove. I told her. Diaz nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Most of us do." The training only got harder after that. Endurance runs that felt endless. Obstacle courses designed to push every muscle to failure. Days where the instructors seemed determined to find the exact moment when your body wanted to give up. One afternoon, we were halfway through a brutal conditioning exercise when the drill instructor stopped in front of me. He stared at the name on my uniform. "Reynolds," he said. "Yes, sir." "You look like you're thinking too much." "I'm focused." "Sir," he shook his head. "People who come here trying to prove something usually wash out," he said. "The Marines don't care about your personal drama." Then he pointed toward the end of the training field. "Run it again." By the time I finished that course, my legs felt like they were made of concrete. I collapsed onto the grass, trying to catch my breath. Diaz dropped down beside me. "You're still here," she said. "Barely," she laughed. "Barely still counts." Weeks passed. Some recruits quit. Others were sent home. But every day I woke up and put the uniform on again. Not because I was trying to prove something to the instructors. Because somewhere in Savannah there was a kitchen table where my future had been written off in black ink. And I intended to rewrite it. One evening during mail call, the drill instructor walked down the aisle handing out letters. Most people were desperate for them. Messages from home meant a reminder that someone out there believed in you. When he reached my bunk, he dropped a single envelope onto the mattress. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The handwriting was Olivia's. I unfolded the paper slowly. There was no greeting. No congratulations. Just a few short sentences. The company is expanding faster than ever. Dad landed the biggest shipping contract we've ever had. Turns out the business runs perfectly fine without you. Then, at the bottom of the page, she added one more line. "Leaving might have been the best thing you ever did for us." I folded the letter carefully and slid it into my locker. For a moment I sat on the edge of the bunk staring at the metal floor. I expected anger, or maybe hurt. Instead I felt something colder. Resolve. Later that night, after lights out, I pulled the folded note from my jacket pocket. The one from the kitchen table. The paper had started to crease along the edges from being carried around so long. The front still read the same sentence. "The Marines will ruin your future." I turned it over. "Watch me." Across the room, Diaz whispered quietly from her bunk. "You still awake?" "Yeah." "You're thinking about home again, aren't you?" I hesitated. "Something like that." She shifted in the darkness. "People don't usually hate something that much unless they're hiding something," she said. "What do you mean?" "My dad used to blame the government for everything," she said. "Turns out he just didn't want anyone looking too closely at his business." Her words stayed in my mind the next day during a logistics briefing. The instructor projected a slide showing several civilian companies that supported marine supply operations. I barely paid attention until one name appeared on the screen: Reynolds Logistics. The same company my father had spent his entire life building. The same company that supposedly hated everything connected to the Marines. My stomach tightened. I stared at the screen as the instructor continued speaking about supply routes and contractor networks. One question kept repeating in my mind. Why would a man who despised the Marines build a company that worked for them? I kept staring at the screen long after the briefing ended. Most of the recruits had already filed out of the classroom, their chairs scraping against the floor as they rushed toward the next training block. The instructor was shutting down the projector, but the image of that single slide was still burned into my mind. Reynolds Logistics. The name sat there in my memory like something that didn't belong. For years, my father had talked about the Marines as if they were a threat, something dangerous, something that ruined lives and families. Yet the company he spent every waking hour protecting was listed as part of a marine logistics network. I walked out of the room feeling like the ground under my feet had shifted. That evening, Diaz found me sitting alone on the concrete steps outside the barracks. "You've been quiet all day," she said, dropping down beside me. "I saw something earlier," I said. "What kind of something?" I hesitated. "My family owns a logistics company," I told her. "Reynolds Logistics." She looked at me. "Waiting." "That name showed up in a marine supply briefing today." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "So your family's company works with the military." "That's the strange part," I said. "My father hates the Marines." Diaz leaned back against the railing. "Hate is a strong word. He told me they destroy people's futures." I said. "Said they ruin families? And yet his company works with them." "Apparently." She let out a quiet breath. "You ever think maybe there's more going on there than you know?" I stared out across the training yard where the lights were starting to flicker on for evening drills. That's exactly what I'm starting to wonder. The next day I paid closer attention during every logistics lecture. Most recruits treated those classes like background noise. They were more interested in weapons training and field exercises. But the logistics system was the backbone of everything the Marines did. Supply convoys, transportation networks, civilian contractors. The instructors explained how private companies handled massive portions of the military's transportation system. Companies like Reynolds Logistics. During one lecture, the instructor mentioned how contractors were selected. Every company working with the Marine Corps must pass strict compliance audits, he said. Financial records, transportation capacity, safety procedures. Everything gets reviewed. A recruit raised his hand. "What happens if a company fails the audit?" The instructor didn't hesitate. "They lose the contract immediately," he said. "And depending on the violation, it can trigger a federal investigation." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. That night I couldn't stop thinking about something from my childhood. I must have been 16. I had walked into my father's office late one evening looking for a spare truck key. The lights were still on. And he was standing by the filing cabinet flipping through a stack of documents. When he saw me in the doorway, he slammed the drawer shut. "You don't come in here without knocking," he said sharply. I remember being surprised. My father rarely raised his voice. "I was just looking for the spare key," I told him. He stepped between me and the cabinet. "I'll handle the office," he said. "You focus on school. At the time, it seemed like nothing. Just another rule in a house full of rules. But now that moment felt different. Like a door I had never been allowed to open. A few days later, another letter arrived. The handwriting was Olivia's again. I opened it slowly, expecting more sarcasm. Instead, the letter was full of excitement. Dad just secured the biggest contract the company has ever had. She wrote, "We're expanding 2 warehouses and adding new shipping routes across the southeast." I read the line twice. Expanding. New routes. Then I noticed something else she had written at the bottom. "Dad always said you wouldn't understand how the real world works." The sentence felt strange, almost defensive, like she was trying to convince herself of something. I folded the letter and slipped it into my locker beside the first one. Later that week, we spent an entire afternoon studying supply corridors used by military convoys moving equipment through the eastern states. Large transportation networks stretched across the map. Major highways, regional transfer points, civilian contractor hubs. As the instructor traced one route with a laser pointer, my attention locked onto the screen. The route ran straight through Georgia, through Savannah, my hometown, and just a few miles from that route was a warehouse symbol marking one of the contractor facilities. Reynolds Logistics. I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me. If I stayed in the Marines long enough, if I moved into logistics operations, one day I could end up supervising the same supply network my family was working inside. The thought didn't feel like revenge. Not yet. It felt like something quieter. Accountability. At the end of the week, the training staff posted new assignment lists for the next stage of specialization. Recruits gathered around the board reading their names. Weapons training. Communications. Engineering support. I stepped closer and scanned the list. When I found my name, I froze. Reynolds. Ava. Convoy Logistics Coordination Track. I stared at the assignment sheet for a long moment. The path in front of me suddenly looked very different than it had just a few months earlier. If Reynolds Logistics remained part of the military supply network, and if I continued down this track, there might come a day when I wouldn't just see my family's company on a slide in a briefing room. There might come a day when I was the one responsible for inspecting it. And for the first time since leaving home, I wondered if the Marines weren't just shaping my future. Maybe they were quietly leading me straight back to the truth my family never wanted me to see. By the time I finished advanced training, the Marines no longer felt like something I had joined out of defiance. They felt like the first place that had ever expected something real from me. Not my last name, not the business I was born into, just my ability to do the job. The Convoy Logistics program was smaller than the other specializations. Only a handful of us had been selected, and the instructors made it clear that the work we were learning carried serious responsibility. Battles are won by logistics. One officer told us during the first week of training, if the supplies don't move, nothing else matters. We spent long days studying supply routes, contractor compliance, and convoy coordination. Everything had to be precise. Fuel counts, cargo manifests, transportation schedules. Mistakes in logistics didn't just slow things down. They could cost lives. And civilian contractors played a bigger role than I had ever imagined. Companies across the country worked with the military to move equipment, food, fuel, and construction materials through massive transportation networks. Every one of those companies had to follow strict regulations. Every contract could be audited. During one lecture, the instructor walked us through several examples of contractor violations. One company had inflated its delivery capacity to win a contract. Another had secretly hired unregistered subcontractors. A third had falsified transportation logs to hide delayed shipments. Some companies think they're smarter than the system. The instructor said, "Eventually, the system proves them wrong." The words stuck with me longer than they probably should have. Because every example he described sounded like something that could happen inside a logistics company. A company like Reynolds Logistics. Later that evening, Diaz found me sitting in the mess hall staring at a printed supply map. "You're doing that thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The thinking too much thing." She slid into the seat across from me. "What's on your mind this time?" I tapped the map. "This route runs through Savannah," I said. She looked at the map, then back at me. "Your hometown?" "Yeah. And your family's warehouse is there, right along the corridor." She leaned back in the chair. "So let me get this straight," she said slowly. "Your family runs a company that works inside a military supply network, and you're now training to supervise those networks. When you say it like that, it sounds strange." "It is strange." I didn't argue. Because it was... The next month we moved into operational simulation training. We practiced convoy coordination using real contractor databases. Our job was to verify that supply partners met all the requirements before shipments moved through a route. Documentation. Safety compliance. Subcontractor registration. Everything had to match the contract. One afternoon, our instructor handed out a list of active contractors connected to our training scenario. "Review these companies," he said. "Assume you're responsible for verifying their compliance." I scanned the sheet without much interest. Then I saw the name Reynolds Logistics, the same company that had appeared in the earlier briefing. But this time there was more information attached. The company had recently expanded its operations. New warehouse facilities. Additional transfer points along several southeastern supply routes, including one corridor running straight through Georgia. Through Savannah. My chest tightened slightly. After class, I stayed behind and reviewed the contractor file again. The expansion contract was large. Large enough to push Reynolds Logistics into a major role in the regional supply network, which meant the company my father spent his life building was now deeply connected to the system I served in uniform. I sat there for a long time staring at the file. Years ago, my father had looked me in the eye and told me the Marines would destroy my future. Yet his company depended on the same organization he warned me about. That irony felt impossible to ignore. That night, I sat alone in the barracks reading through the training materials again. Civilian contractors. Compliance inspections. Convoy oversight. Every section repeated the same message. No contractor was above the system. Every company could be audited. Every facility could be inspected. I pulled the folded note from my locker and opened it. The words on the front hadn't changed. "The Marines will ruin your future." I turned it over. "Watch me." For years, those two words had felt like a promise made out of anger. Now they felt different. Like a quiet decision. If the Marines ever sent me to inspect a contractor facility connected to my family's company, I wouldn't hide from it. I wouldn't avoid it. I would do the job exactly the way I had been trained to do it. No favoritism. No protection. Just the truth. A week later, the operations office released the schedule for our first real convoy assignment. Diaz and I stood with a group of Marines reviewing the briefing screen. Supply transport through the southeastern corridor. Multiple contractor inspection stops. I scanned the list of locations until my eyes found the final one. Savannah, Georgia. Contractor facility. Reynolds Logistics Distribution Warehouse. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. That building sat less than 2 miles from the house where my family had told me to leave. The same warehouse where my father once expected me to spend the rest of my life. Now the Marines were sending me there wearing their uniform. The instructor finished the briefing and dismissed the group. People began filing out of the room, talking about travel schedules and convoy assignments. I remained where I was, looking at the name on the screen. For years I thought leaving Savannah meant leaving my family behind. But the Marines had just done something I never expected. They had sent me straight back to their doorstep. The convoy rolled out just after sunrise. Engines rumbled across the base as a line of military transport trucks pulled onto the highway one by one. Diesel smoke drifted into the cold morning air while radios crackled between drivers and convoy coordinators. I stood beside the lead vehicle reviewing the route sheet one last time before climbing inside. Multiple supply stops. 2 compliance inspections. Final contractor checkpoint. Savannah, Georgia. My hometown was the last destination on the list. Years earlier, I had left that city with a duffel bag and a folded note in my pocket. Now I was returning in a Marine convoy. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once we were on the road, the convoy settled into a steady rhythm. Truck after truck moved in formation along the highway, while the escort vehicles kept the line tight and organized. Logistics work wasn't glamorous, but it required discipline. Every mile mattered. Every vehicle had to stay on schedule. I monitored the Convoy communication channel and checked off each checkpoint as we passed it. By midday, we were already deep into Georgia. Diaz leaned over from the passenger seat studying the route tablet mounted near the dashboard. "You've been quiet all morning," she said. "I'm working." "No," she said. "You're thinking..." She tapped the map with her finger. "Savannah," she said. I nodded. "That's the one." She leaned back in her seat. "So this is really happening." "Looks that way." She studied me for a moment. "You can still ask command to move someone else onto the inspection team when we get there." I shook my head. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." She watched me carefully. "This is your family we're talking about." I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I didn't come this far to turn around now. The convoy crossed the Savannah River late in the afternoon. The skyline appeared slowly in the distance, rising above the water like a memory I had buried for years. As we moved through the city streets, familiar places began to appear. The diner where my mother used to take us on Saturday mornings. The park where Olivia and I used to ride bikes as kids. The waterfront where I had watched cargo ships moving through the harbor long before I ever understood what the Reynolds family business actually did. Every street carried pieces of the life I had left behind. But the feeling was different now. Back then I had believed the city belonged to my family. Now I saw it for what it really was. Just another place on a logistics route. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the folded piece of paper still tucked inside. The note from the kitchen table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The convoy turned onto the industrial highway leading toward the warehouse district. Rows of cargo buildings stretched across the horizon, each one surrounded by stacks of shipping containers and loading docks. And then I saw it. The Reynolds Logistics Warehouse. The large steel building stood exactly where it always had. Its company logo painted across the side in bold blue letters. For a moment, I could almost picture the younger version of myself walking through those loading bays with a clipboard in my hand, while my father explained how shipments were scheduled. Back then, he believed I would eventually run the place. Now I was arriving to inspect it. "Convoy slowing," Diaz said as the vehicles ahead of us began reducing speed. The line of trucks rolled toward the entrance gate. Warehouse workers started stepping outside, shielding their eyes from the late afternoon sun as they watched the approaching military vehicles. Military convoys didn't visit facilities like this every day. Curiosity spread quickly across the loading docks. I stepped out of the vehicle as the trucks came to a stop. The sound of engines idling filled the yard. Boots hit the pavement as Marines climbed down from their vehicles and began preparing inspection equipment. Several warehouse employees gathered near the main office entrance. And then the office door opened. My father stepped outside first. Daniel Reynolds still carried himself with the same rigid posture I remembered from childhood. His gray hair was shorter now, but the expression on his face was exactly the same. Controlled. Careful. Behind him came Olivia. She folded her arms immediately, scanning the convoy like someone trying to calculate why a line of military vehicles had arrived at her workplace. Neither of them noticed me yet. From where they stood, I was just another Marine stepping out of a truck. I began walking toward the office with Diaz and 2 compliance officers beside me. Each step echoed against the concrete. Years ago, I had walked out of this place believing I might never see it again. Now I was crossing the same yard wearing the uniform my family said would ruin my future. My father stepped forward to greet the approaching inspection team. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "Can we help you with something?" Then his eyes moved across the group. They landed on the name tag on my uniform. For a moment he frowned slightly, like he was looking at something familiar but couldn't quite place it. Olivia followed his gaze. Her expression shifted slowly. Confusion. Recognition. Shock. Before either of them could speak, I stopped a few feet away and addressed them the same way I would address any contractor. "Lieutenant Ava Reynolds," I said calmly. "United States Marine Corps." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I'm here to conduct the logistics inspection. No one spoke for several seconds after I introduced myself. The sound of the convoy engines idling behind me filled the silence. Workers stood frozen near the loading docks, glancing between the Marines and the Reynolds family like they were watching a scene that didn't make sense. My father was the first to recover. "Ava," he said slowly. The way he said my name felt strange, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it anymore. Olivia stepped forward before he could say anything else. "So this is what you came back for," she said sharply. "A little revenge tour in a Marine uniform." I didn't react. "This inspection is part of a scheduled logistics review," I said evenly. "All contractors along the supply corridor are being verified for compliance." She gave a short laugh. "Convenient." Behind me, Diaz and the inspection officers began unloading equipment from the convoy trucks. Clipboards, tablets, documentation kits. The Marines moved with calm efficiency, spreading out across the loading area. My father forced a polite smile and straightened his jacket. "Well," he said carefully, "Reynolds Logistics has always cooperated with government partners. You're welcome to review whatever you need." The calm tone didn't hide the tension in his voice. I nodded once. "Thank you. We'll begin with your shipping records and contractor documentation." Within minutes, the inspection team had set up inside the warehouse office. Stacks of files were pulled from cabinets. Shipment logs were opened. Cargo manifests were compared with transport schedules stored in the military database. At first, everything looked routine. Then one of the compliance officers raised his hand. "Lieutenant," he said. I stepped over to his desk. He pointed at 2 different delivery logs on the screen. "These shipments are listed under separate transport routes," he said. "But they show identical timestamps." I looked closer. 2 shipments. Same cargo code. Same departure time. But different transportation paths. "That shouldn't happen," I said quietly. Across the room, Olivia noticed the conversation. "What's the issue?" she demanded. "Just verifying some documentation," I said. Her expression tightened. The inspection continued. Another Marine began reviewing subcontractor agreements attached to the shipment records. After several minutes, he frowned. "Lieutenant," he said. I walked over. "This subcontractor isn't registered in the system," he said, tapping the screen. The name appeared multiple times across the shipment logs. Yet the military contractor database showed no registration under that company. "Are these subcontractors part of your transport network?" I asked my father. He hesitated for a moment. "They're temporary partners," he said. "Small companies we occasionally work with. They're required to be registered with the logistics network," I said. Olivia stepped forward again. "Do you really think we don't know how our own business works?" she snapped. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm just verifying the records." The room grew quiet again as the Marines continued their work. More documents were opened. More records compared. The irregularities started to add up. Shipment weights that didn't match inventory logs. Delivery routes that appeared twice under different codes. Invoices that were larger than the actual cargo value. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Eventually, my father walked over and touched my arm lightly. "Ava," he said quietly. "Can we talk in my office?" I nodded and followed him down the hallway. The room looked exactly the same as it had years ago. The same wooden desk. The same filing cabinets. The same framed photos of the company's early days hanging on the wall. My father closed the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You don't have to do this," he said finally. I folded my arms. "Do what?" he sighed. "This inspection. It's part of my assignment." He looked at the floor before speaking again. "There are things about running a business that you don't understand yet," he said. "Sometimes paperwork doesn't match perfectly. Compliance regulations exist for a reason." "Ava," he said, his voice tightening. "This company feeds dozens of families in this city. And the Marines depend on accurate logistics," I said. His eyes met mine. "We're still family." The words hung in the air between us. For a second, I thought about the kitchen table. The note. The morning they told me to leave. "If there's nothing wrong here, I said quietly. Then the inspection will confirm that. His expression shifted. And if there is something wrong, then it gets reported. For the first time since I walked into the warehouse, my father looked genuinely afraid. We returned to the main office. The Marines were still reviewing files when Diaz approached me. "You need to see this," she said. She showed me a shipment record flagged by the compliance software. "This subcontractor appears in 12 different deliveries," she said. "But none of the paperwork exists in the Federal Contractor Registry." "That's not possible," I said, "unless someone bypassed the registration system." Across the room, Olivia was arguing with one of the investigators. "You can't just dig through our internal files like this," she said. "The contracts give us authority to review logistics documentation." The Marine replied calmly. I watched the scene unfold while the weight of the situation settled in. This wasn't just a messy set of records. It was something larger. If the subcontractor network wasn't registered, then the shipments moving through those routes had bypassed military compliance systems entirely, which meant the investigation could expand far beyond a simple inspection. Diaz lowered her voice. "We're going to have to report this up the chain." I nodded slowly. Across the warehouse floor, my father stood near the loading dock watching us. For years, he had controlled every decision inside this building. Every contract, every shipment, every expansion plan. Now he stood there waiting for the Marines to decide what happened next. And for the first time in my life, he looked like the one who had lost control. The warehouse no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like the center of a storm. Marines moved steadily between desks and filing cabinets, while compliance officers reviewed shipment records on their tablets. The quiet confidence in their movements made the tension in the room even heavier. Every few minutes, another document was placed on the central inspection table. Another shipment record. Another invoice. Another transport log. Piece by piece, the story of Reynolds Logistics began to unfold in front of everyone. I stood near the table watching the investigators compare files with the Federal Logistics database. One officer pointed to a spreadsheet on his screen. "Lieutenant, these shipment numbers appear twice," he said. I leaned closer. 2 separate delivery records. Same cargo identification code. Same weight. Same departure date. But 2 different delivery invoices, which meant someone had billed the contract twice for the same shipment. Across the room, Olivia noticed the discussion. "What's the problem now?" she asked sharply. The officer didn't look up. "We're verifying transport records." Her voice rose. "You're treating us like criminals." No one answered. The investigators continued working. A few minutes later, another Marine stepped forward with a stack of printed invoices. "These payments don't match the delivery manifests," he said. He placed the papers on the table. Multiple charges listed under emergency transport fees. But the delivery logs showed no emergency shipments during those dates. The room grew even quieter. Employees who had been watching from the doorway slowly stepped back. My father stood near the loading dock with his arms folded, his eyes following every movement the Marines made. Eventually, he walked toward me. "Ava," he said quietly. I turned to face him. "There are things you don't understand about running a business," he said. "Then explain them." His eyes moved across the inspection table where the documents were spread out. "The shipping industry is competitive," he said. "Companies cut corners just to survive. Falsifying logistics records isn't cutting corners." He lowered his voice. "It started small." I said nothing. "Years ago, we lost a government contract," he continued. "The company nearly collapsed. We had employees with families depending on us. So you changed the paperwork. We adjusted operations." I shook my head. "You manipulated military contracts." His shoulders sagged slightly. "You make it sound simple." "Because it is." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he said something that had been sitting in my mind since childhood. "This is why I never wanted you joining the Marines." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" His expression tightened. "Years ago, the Marines audited our company," he said. "That investigation nearly destroyed us." "So you blamed them." "I blamed the system that nearly shut us down. And when I said I wanted to join it, You became a risk. The words landed harder than I expected. You weren't worried about my future, I said quietly. You were worried about your business. He didn't answer. Across the room, Diaz approached us. Lieutenant, she said. I walked back toward the inspection table. Another investigator had opened a digital ledger pulled from the warehouse computer system. Highlighted entries filled the screen. Unregistered subcontractors, inflated shipping fees, duplicate invoices. This pattern goes back several years, the officer said. Multiple contracts. I asked. Yes. Ma'am. Olivia stepped closer, her face pale now. You're twisting normal business operations into something else, she said. The investigator pointed to the screen. These shipments were processed through subcontractors that don't exist in the contractor registry. They're independent transport partners. They're unregistered. Her voice rose. You're destroying our company? I stepped forward. No, I said calmly. The records are doing that. For the first time since the inspection started. Olivia looked uncertain. You always hated the business, she said. I hated being told my life was already decided. Her expression hardened. You walked away from this family. You told me to leave. Before she could respond, another convoy vehicle rolled into the yard outside. Through the warehouse windows, we watched additional Marines step out carrying investigation cases. Word of the irregularities had already reached higher command. The situation had escalated. Employees gathered outside the building watching the military vehicles park around the warehouse. The same convoy that had delivered supplies earlier now surrounded the facility like a silent perimeter. My father stood near the loading dock staring out at the trucks. For years, those vehicles had been part of the system his company depended on. Now they looked like something else entirely. Witnesses. He walked toward me slowly. I built this company from almost nothing, he said quietly. I know. And now it's falling apart. I didn't answer. After a moment, he spoke again. You were right to leave. The words were barely louder than the engines outside. I looked at him, searching for anger in his voice. But there wasn't any. Just exhaustion. Across the warehouse floor, investigators continued cataloging documents and securing files. The truth was no longer hidden inside a locked office cabinet. It was spread across tables for everyone to see. As the sun began to set outside the warehouse windows, the convoy engine started again. The investigation had only just begun, and the empire my family had protected for years was already starting to collapse. 3 weeks after the convoy left Savannah, my life looked almost normal again. Almost. The base moved at its usual rhythm. Convoys arrived and departed. Radios buzzed with logistics updates. Trucks rolled through the gates before sunrise and returned long after dark. From the outside, nothing had changed. But every time I passed the operations board, I remembered the warehouse, the loading docks, the way the room fell silent when the first irregularities appeared in those shipping records. I had spent years believing the hardest moment of my life was the morning my family told me to leave. Now I understood something different. The hardest moment was watching the truth surface in front of people who had spent years trying to bury it. Official updates about the Reynolds logistics investigation came through internal channels a few days later. The military suspended the company's logistics contracts immediately. All shipments tied to the Reynolds network were reassigned to other contractors, while a federal compliance audit began reviewing the records in detail. From what the report said, investigators were examining several years of financial and shipping data, duplicate invoices, unregistered subcontractors, inflated delivery charges. The list was longer than I expected. I sat in the operations office reading the report on a tablet while the rest of the logistics team prepared a new convoy route for the following week. For a moment I felt something close to regret. Not because the investigation happened, but because I finally understood how fragile the empire my father built had always been. It hadn't collapsed in a single day. It had been cracking for years. Diaz dropped into the chair beside me. You look like you just read the ending of a very long story, she said. Something like that. She glanced at the screen. That about your family's company? Yeah. And The contracts are suspended. She nodded slowly. That was going to happen eventually. I locked the tablet and leaned back in my chair. I never wanted to destroy them, I said. You didn't, she replied. The paperwork did. Outside the window, another convoy was forming near the loading area. Engines started one after another while Marines moved between vehicles checking cargo straps and route documents. Watching them work reminded me why I had joined in the first place. The Marines never cared where you came from, only whether you could do the job. A few nights later, after a long shift, I finally turned my phone back on. I hadn't touched it since the day we left Savannah. The screen lit up with notifications immediately. Voicemails, messages, missed calls. Dozens of them. I scrolled slowly through the list. My father, my mother, Olivia, even a few relatives I barely spoke to anymore. 47 missed calls in total. For a long time, I simply stared at the number. Years ago, those same people had watched me walk out of our house without trying to stop me. Now they were all trying to reach me. I sat on the edge of my bunk and turned the phone over in my hand. Part of me expected anger. Another part expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt something quieter. Distance. I opened the small drawer beside my bed and pulled out the folded piece of paper I had carried with me since the day I left home. The edges were worn now from years of being folded and unfolded. I opened it slowly. The same sentence stared back at me. The Marines will ruin your future. Leave this house. I turned the page over. 2 words were written on the back in ink that had faded slightly with time. Watch me. For years, those words had carried every ounce of anger I felt toward my family. Now they meant something different. They meant I had survived without their approval. I folded the paper again and placed it beside the phone. The missed calls were still there, waiting. But for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to answer them immediately. Not because I hated my family, but because my life no longer depended on their approval. Later that night, I walked outside the barracks and stood near the edge of the base. Another convoy was preparing to leave. Headlights cut through the darkness while drivers climbed into their trucks. The sound of engines starting rolled across the asphalt. For a moment, it reminded me of the day our convoy stopped outside the warehouse in Savannah. The day my past and my future collided in the same parking lot. My father once told me the Marines would destroy my future. He was wrong. They gave me something stronger than anything my family ever tried to build. They gave me my own path. And sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life is the day they stop trying to prove their worth to people who never believed in them. If you've ever been told your dreams would ruin your future, if someone close to you ever said you weren't capable of becoming more than what they expected, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. And if stories about family drama, revenge, and people turning their lives around resonate with you, make sure you stay with this channel. Subscribe and join a community that believes everyone deserves the chance to prove themselves. Because sometimes the most powerful response to doubt is only 2 words. Watch me.